Okay, good evening. Tonight I'd like to talk about African Americans in the Union Navy. Typically, what we know about blacks serving the military during the rebellion comes from their experience in the USCT troops, the United States Colored Troops. This has been most recently portrayed, of course, in the 1989 movie Glory, which talks about the 54th Mass. Those were one of many regiments, about 150 of infantry, artillery, and cavalry. There were actually 179,000 black soldiers in the Union Army, which is a full 10%. Because we don't study that much Navy history, we typically think that their experience just extends out to the Navy's experience. Not really true, which we'll see. For instance, if you were in the 54th or another USCT regiment, you would have found out that it definitely wasn't equal. You were separate and definitely not equal. For instance, their pay was often delayed. When that pay came in, it was lower than it was for white soldiers. Furthermore, there were deductions for clothing of $3. They got inferior medical care and oftentimes inferior equipment. It wasn't the exact same as in white units. They were segregated into all black units with, until near the end of the war, all white officers. The fact that it was so different in the Navy, as we shall see, is really because of the efforts of this fellow, Gideon Welles, who's Secretary of the Navy. He is a staunch abolitionist, but to understand his efforts and why they were so important, we have to go back a number of decades and see how the Navy enlisted and treated African-American sailors. During the Revolution, the Continental Navy actually had thousands of black sailors. What's more, there were state navies and privateer navies, and those numbers increased when you got away from the Continental Navy, of course, which had the job of going and hunting for trouble. State navies stayed near home and just defended the coast, and privateers, of course, don't want to fight, they want to make money. So you get a lot more people of all stripes on those ships. Unfortunately, at the end of the war, despite how equal or at least fair that treatment was, the Navy is disbanded. It costs too much to maintain a fleet, and so the Continental Navy is gone not years later. In 1798, the U.S. Navy is founded by President Jefferson. We are in what's called a quasi-war with France. There's some shooting on the high seas, but there's no actual declaration of war, and he funds 6 different frigates, including old Ironsides, to become the U.S. Navy. When that tension dies down after a couple of years, there's an economic boom that's occasioned by the Napoleonic Wars. France and England carried most of the world's trade in their merchant ships. With them fighting each other and therefore making it dangerous for either fleet to take to sea, suddenly there's a big opportunity for America to jump in and do all the trade around the world. So a lot of white sailors fled the discipline, the harsh discipline and terrible living conditions of the Navy, and went for better paying jobs in the merchant marine. By 1812, fully 10% of the US Navy is now African American. That number goes even higher with the beginning of the war. In 1813, at the Battle of Lake Erie, or Battle of the Lakes as it's called, fully half of Oliver Hazard Perry's crew are African American, including 360 Marines that are scattered throughout his 9-ship fleet. There are glimmers of equality here, proven in battle. These quotes are from a couple of officers. Isaac Chauncey, of course, pointed out that the color of the coat and the color of the skin make no difference as far as a man's qualifications and usefulness go. Another officer, when asked by President Madison if his black sailors would run when the British came to attack them in a shore battery, said no, they don't know how to run. They will die at their guns first. Usher Parsons is the only fleet surgeon who's not flat on his back with illness during the Battle of the Lakes in 1813. In 1862, the Massachusetts Historical Society, probably trying to get some background information on whether or not blacks should be allowed in the Navy on a large scale at the beginning of the Civil War, asked him to relate his experiences back in the War of 1812. And he replied that really there was no sense of prejudice, that the crews were integrated, that men ate together, managed sails, managed guns. Another story that echoes what Parsons is saying is people of New York invited a warship's crew to a theatrical performance as a way to honor their bravery in battle. And they were amazed when the entire company marched in and sat down in the pit to realize that half the crew were African American. In 1812, several states, the government passes the Militia Act. The militia is actually America's first line of defense against Native Americans, against slave insurrections, even against an invading army. The army is the second line of defense. And it was considered that black soldiers, despite their excellent performance in War of 1812, were no longer fit to serve beside white soldiers. By 1815, the army itself bans blacks from serving. In 1822, although the Navy has not made any such prohibition, the southern states grow worried that too many black federal sailors visiting southern ports might cause unrest among the slave population. So if you're a black federal sailor and you pull into Charleston or Savannah or Richmond, you get to spend your liberty in a jail cell. And when your white shipmates are done partying and whatever, get back to ship, you're free to go back to your ship. In 1837, just as there had been an economic upturn in the rest of the shipping industry that saw white sailors leave the fleet, there's a recession in 1837. So now white sailors need jobs in the fleet, and to make sure there's enough room for them, they usher out a lot of blacks and set a limit of 5% black crew. So why is it that white sailors only want to serve in the Navy whenever times are bad? Sailors are typically looked down upon at this point in history. There are restaurants along the seacoast with posted signs saying no dogs or sailors allowed. Two books that we treat and make our kids read as great literature were actually exposés. In 1834, Dana's book, 2 Years Before the Mast, told his story in the civilian merchant marine of the hideous conditions, and Herman Melville did the same for the Navy in White Jacket in 1850. It was said that experiencing life at sea under Navy discipline was the closest a white man could come to experiencing slavery. For those who had experienced slavery, however, it was an opportunity for a steady job. You could raise a family ashore in a safe environment. You were going to bring home a paycheck, even though you might be gone for a year or two. It was a source of revenue and stability for blacks that they weren't allowed to experience anywhere else at that time. At the start of the war, the fleet is so predominantly white, even that 5% quota is only half filled. Only 2.5% of the fleet is African American. So there's a lot of room for expansion. The Navy at this point is desperate for men. They're actually gunboats sitting idle for lack of crews. A couple reasons for this. Whenever the federal government said, you know, Massachusetts or Connecticut, you have to send for so many men, only enlistments in the Army count towards that quota. If 100 men join the Navy, they don't count towards that quota. So the states want to usher men into the Army. The states, the towns, sometimes even companies were not paying bounties for sailors for the same reason. They want to shunt men into the Army as quickly as possible. Now, blacks are barred from serving the Army at this point in time, and there's a pool of recruits, which Gideon Welles immediately jumps upon. He enlists 300 free African Americans from northern ports. This opportunity was immediately perceived by the free black community in the North. In 1862, the Liberator, a Boston abolitionist paper, has a great line here. The Navy has not been in the habit of examining a seaman's complexion before shipping him. Can you fight is the only question. The other question, of course, is how does Welles get away with this? How can he recruit so many black sailors at the same time he's slapping down generals for trying to recruit black soldiers in remote places like Louisiana and in the Carolinas? The difference is the way the two institutions recruit. If you want to join the Army, typically an Army recruiter would come to your town or village or city, and you would join along with friends, family, co-workers, whoever's in town, and be shipped off to one regiment. You will drill on the public green or camps that are often open to the public. Everyone in town knows exactly who's in that regiment, who's in that company. And so any mixing of races would be immediately noticed and commented upon. The Navy, however, is a federal institution. They don't care what the states or the people think. When you enlist in the Navy, they don't come to you. You go to what's called a rendezvous, literally a get-together at a portside town like Boston. Along with your friends and families and co-workers that go with you are men from probably all 6 New England states, a few from Canada, and any foreign sailor that wants to jump ship and join the Union Navy. You're all mixed together on board that receiving ship, which is usually a dismasted old ship of the line roofed over, until you're called for. A lot of these guys bring their skills with them. Others are learning it. The Navy was big on, you know, job training by experience in the fleet. But no one asks you who your friends and family or coworkers when it's time to be pulled to a certain squadron. Basically, it's you, and you come with me. Even when you get to that squadron, you might be salted out among a variety of ships. So there's no way to keep track of anybody as far as keeping people together. Also, because the Navy had always been integrated out of necessity, always desperate for men, they were open to all comers, especially those 900 blacks that were going to fill Welles's quota. The Navy has 2 distinct groups of recruits. One are Northern Freemen, who bring quite a lot of experience with them, nautical experience, both from previous Navy enlistments, the Merchant Marine, and the whaling fleet. In fact, 63% of free Northern blacks come with nautical experience. They are given rank based on their ability. Contrabands, on the other hand, freed Southern blacks, don't have much experience at all. I think about 30% of them actually bring some nautical skill to them. They're supposed to be enlisted at the very lowest rank. Wells works around this, as we'll see. Wells liked to operate within the letter of the law, but he promoted the spirit of the law among his officers. For instance, all recruits who are contrabands are supposed to be enlisted as boys. And I'll rapidly point out, this is not a slur. This is legitimate Navy rank. There are 3 classes of boy, and then you go up Landsmen and Seaman and all that stuff. But they're supposed to be listed as boys so that on paper, freed slaves won't outrank any white sailor. However, by the time they get on board ship, 68% of them are immediately rated as landsmen, which is four ranks up, for goodness sakes. As soon as the officers on board ship saw they had some skills, they knew that Wells was not going to chastise them for promoting them. They are promoting locally, so Wells, of course, has plausible deniability, but the end result is the same. He's enlisting people based on their skills. Now, one surprise that was a shock to the Navy was they had not expected the massive influx of escaping slaves. You have to remember that it was the Navy that penetrated the South first through all those creeks and rivers and streams. A lot of the gunboats are only have a draft of 3 to 6 feet of water. So they're going far, far into the South, far up the rivers to point like daggers into the heartland of the Confederacy. And one fellow said that they got 6 to 8 contrabands a night, swimming or boating out to the gunboat. One patrol came back literally with 700 to 1,000 contrabands on a single flat barge, if you will, towing behind them. I think the quote was that at one end there was a wedding, at the other end there was a baptism, and in the middle of church service. It was that big. They don't know what to do with these people. They don't want to turn them back to Confederate lines. For one, it's inhumane. Secondly, they're setting up defenses for the Confederacy. That's hence the word contraband. They're an illegal commodity, if you will, helping the Southern war effort. The Army solution, of course, is just to put them on trains or march them all north into camps. I was going to say concentration camps, not quite that bad, but they're just collected and stored, if you will. This is cruel. One, they're not given employment. Secondly, you take a lot of people who are used to Southern warmth during the winter and you subject them to a northern winter. It was inhumane. The Navy, on the other hand, decided, well, we don't have enough gunboats to put everyone on board and take them north, and we can't take them offline to use as taxis. We can't bring transport ships down. What the Navy did was unique. They began to set up small camps near their bases and defended them not only with 1 or 2 gunboats and administered them with a Navy officer assigned to the camp, but again, very, very much on the QT, Lincoln allowed fleeing Unionists who also inhabited the camps and the African-American contraband to learn how to handle weapons so they could defend themselves if the rebels attacked. There are a number of these camps along the southern coast. About this same time, in March of '62, there's a milestone that has been totally lost to history. I ran across it in a privately published memoir from one of the principal characters here. It's quite telling. Whenever the famous battle between Monitor and Merrimack, or Virginia as the Southerners call her, took place on March 8th, the telegraph line to DC was spotty. It had just been installed. It wasn't working well. Lincoln is sitting in his office with the Secretary of the Navy Wells and Secretary of the Army Stanton, and they're getting sporadic reports, and they don't sound good. On the 8th, of course, before the Monitor-Merrimack battle, Virginia is just savaging Congress and Cumberland, sinking the latter one, setting the first one ablaze. And Wells is calmly paying attention, and like Lincoln, he's trying to glean as much data as he can from these reports. How big is she? How fast can she go? How quickly can she turn around? What are her guns? What's her draft? How much water does she take? Stanton, on the other hand, is described by Wells and Lincoln as acting ludicrous. He's literally running up and down the halls, flailing his arms, yelling and screaming, shouting out orders, sitting down to write other orders, coming back to listen for 30 seconds, running off again, repeating the same thing. He is totally freaked out that the Navy's solution to this monster Merrimack, which is the word they typically use, the phrase, is a small gunboat, a cheese box and a raft with just 2 cannon. The next day doesn't do much to reassure him because, of course, Monitor does not sink Merrimack. It's more of a standoff. Stanton decides that if the Navy can't sink this thing, he'll take care of it. He sends representatives to New York to contract for a small number of iron ships he intends to use as rams. Now, this is medieval and ancient approach to warfare. But if you remember the pictures of Virginia or Merrimack, she has a low freeboard. The water barely is below the top of her deck. There's even a theory now that those decks were awash, which would place the ram much lower down, so that if you can ram an iron ship over that freeboard, that deck, it will submerge it. If you can have 4 of them attack from 4 different sides, one might get through. It was a near suicidal idea, but it wasn't a bad idea. Well, Lincoln found out about this and decided that because it floats, Gideon Welles should take care of it. The Navy wants nothing to do with it. They want to fight fire with fire, tech with tech, but Lincoln insists. So the assistant secretary is sent to New York, finishes contracting with the ships, never actually tells the owners it's okay to explain to your crews what they're going to do. They are told only that it's going to be extra hazardous employment, and the crews of the cargo ships have run supplies up the James before. They've been shot at. They've actually practiced with pistol and cutlass. Some have cannon on board to defend themselves, but no one's expecting a mission like this. When the first 2 ships arrived, the first crew to be told what their mission really is, to sink the Merrimack, are on the Illinois. And they refuse service, to use the polite phrase. They mutiny. They refuse to go into combat. This wasn't what we were hired to do. No one explained this to us. And they go back to New York. And so does the captain to try and get a second crew. That evening when they arrive in New York, the engineers from the Illinois meet members of the crew from the second ship, the Arago. And the Arago learns about this. And by the time they get to Virginia, they refuse to serve also. Now, the captain of the Arago, a fellow named Gadsden, doesn't want to go back to New York. He's afraid he loses the contract. So he goes to Fortress Monroe, or Fort Monroe, right there in Hampton Roads, and says to General Wool, I need just 50 guys just to do the grunt work on board the ship. My officers can handle everything else. Wool says, I need 1,000 soldiers. You can't have any of mine, but I do have a pool of men that might suffice if you want to take the gamble. He takes Gadsden out to an assembly of 350 of the stevedores. These are escaped blacks who are living around the base and being employed to load and unload supplies bound for McClellan's army. And Gadsden speaks to them, and they are totally nonplussed. The phrase is that they stood like sphinxes. He didn't make a very moving speech. The quartermaster, a fellow by the strange but actually accurate name, I looked him up, Legrand B. Cannon, then addresses the crowd. And he points out to them what the Monitor, or what the Merrimack had done to the Cumberland Congress, and that the North had brought down ram ships to sink it. And he said that you're now being asked to replace a cowardly white crew that has turned tail. Harsh but true. And he said, no race has ever won its freedom or gained respect without shedding blood. Some of you will be killed, some of you will be injured, all of you will be heroes. I need 50 men to step forward who want to volunteer. And like a scene from a bad B movie, 350 men stepped forward at once. Because they're wanted just for the heavy labor of shoveling coal, raising the anchor, etc., he picks the 50 biggest guys. And when they walk out, the local black population goes wild. They're now going to have a stake in this fight. Several of those men actually stay in the Navy, and I believe some were on the gun crew aboard the Kearsarge that fires the shell that sinks Alabama 2 years later. The fact that they never had the opportunity to actually ram Virginia doesn't take away from this milestone or the bravery they showed in volunteering. Those ram ships, including the Arago with its black crew, might well have been what determined the absence of a second battle. When the Virginia comes out a few weeks later, she fires 2 or 3 long-range shells at Monitor and calls it a day, because along with Monitor come the 4 ram ships on duty waiting to circle around Virginia and put her under the water. So how were blacks treated in the Navy? Remember, Welles is a staunch abolitionist, and that the Navy officers are the first ones to see conditions in the South, and they are horrified. A lot of officers, of course, who were from the South left, and so the Navy is really majority in favor of abolition and fighting the war to free blacks. There are numerous letters home from men officers saying that, you know, I supported the government because it was the government. I had no idea what it was like down here. This has to be stomped out. A lot of the officers also come from the Merchant Marine. In the Merchant Marine, of course, you have a mix of ethnicities, just like you did in the Navy at the time. And they've learned through harsh experience sometimes that the color of the hand doesn't matter that saves you when you're about to be washed overboard. Or if you're in the middle of a battle, no one's going to care who's helping you with the gun. It just has to be done. So they bring an attitude of, it's okay. Of course, there are individual acts of racism. I have one author that seems to delight in doing nothing but bringing out every individual act and extrapolate that's the whole Navy, but there's no institutional racial bias that I've ever detected. No mandate from above, no segregation, nothing against blacks. For instance, remember the slide of the sergeant, the black sergeant, and all the things they didn't get. This is quite a bit different for black sailors. Everyone gets the same clothing allotment. 2 suits of blue and a pair of shoes and a hat every single year. White or black, doesn't matter. You get the same food ration. Sailors ate a monotonous but much healthier diet than soldiers. For one thing, whereas the rebels could block a river, they could cut a railroad line, they could ambush a mule train, supplies to the soldiers could get interrupted pretty easily. The rebels don't have the wherewithal, the Navy, to interdict a Navy supply line. It just comes right down the coast, right to the ships, and back up again. The food situation is so extreme in both directions that scurvy, which of course we associate with sailors universally around the world at this time, is far more of a problem for the Army. 1 in 1,000 sailors contract scurvy. 13 in 1,000 soldiers contract scurvy. And according to a post-war War Department analysis, they consider that scurvy was involved in 10% of post-combat Army deaths just because of the malnutrition. Black sailors get the same medical care as white sailors, and Navy medical care was far better than Army care. This is not totally the fault of the Army. No one expected the number of casualties. No one had seen the effects of mass ranks of, rifled muskets firing against a body of men. And the Army's one modern hospital is in Leavenworth, Kansas, which had been the front in the fight against the Plains Native Americans. The Navy, however, has 5 hospitals along the eastern seaboard, so their trained professionals are right there. Because the Navy doesn't get swamped with the number of casualties, they maintain their professional core. The Army, as we know, had professional doctors, but over time, you get some out-and-out quacks in there from what I've read, and it begins to show. Something as simple as one soldier and one sailor both been wounded. Whether they win or lose their fight with that wound, when the Army and Navy are each done, the Army will take the bandage, hang it up to dry, use it again. The Navy takes the bandage, washes it, hangs it up to dry, and use it again. Something as simple as that makes a big difference. Medical care across the board was improved by the fact that on a ship, they could carry copious supplies of a wide variety of drugs and medicines. The Army doctors have to keep their supplies small to ensure mobility. If it doesn't fit in the wagon, it doesn't go. There's a story of one fellow named Bond, a sailor, who's up a small river when his gunboat is ambushed, and he gets some shrapnel in his chest. And his first care was at a nearby Army hospital where he's put in a segregated ward and all but ignored. And his health begins to go down, and it's not looking good for Bond. He's then transferred back to a Navy hospital in Norfolk, where his health improved. He is put in a segregated ward, but it's segregated by rank. He's in with all the other enlisted sailors, white and black. They just don't count as officers. Bond's health improves, he recovers, and if I remember the story correctly, went on to live a long life and have many, many grandchildren. This is a photograph also of a Navy hospital in 1864 with all the ambulatory patients. I've highlighted all the African-American sailors mixed in with white sailors left and right. This is, and again, an integrated ward, not segregated. Everyone gets the same pay, depending on your race. I mean your rate, not your race. There's no deductions for anything, not for clothes, not for food. This is a system that was tailor-made to allow the Navy pay department to cheat people, because they don't actually pay you money on payday. The fear is that if Seaman Jones decides to save up money and they get to a foreign port and he's dissatisfied with his life, he might take his money, jump ship, sell his uniform, he's gone. They'll never find him again. By limiting the men's actual hard cash in hand, it discourages people from jumping ship. Your pay is kept on a ledger, and while you might be advanced a buck or two for liberty in some Navy port, you don't have the wherewithal to go buy train tickets and food and new clothes to get home. What's nice is that that pay can go home to your wife entirely or in part every single payday. So she and your children are being supported even though you're far away at sea. This is a new thing for the Navy and for the Merchant Marine, where normally you waited, to the end of the cruise to get paid off. It's nice also because the sailors don't have the cash to gamble it away. So they're getting richer just by not being paid. The same bonuses. Sailors were paid a 25% bonus for serving inside black painted ironclads in South Carolina, heat and humidity. Everybody got the bonus, no matter what your race was. Also prize money. Until World War I, if you participated in the capture or destruction of an enemy ship or a blockade runner bringing supplies into the South, you got a cut of the value of it. Half the value of the ship and the ship itself went to the government. The other half was distributed in descending shares from the admiral down to the ship's boys. Some of those ship's boys, by the way, made about $500 for 2 captures one day, which is 4 years worth of pay, by the way. I jumped the gun here a little bit. Same treatment before the law. There's a really telling story from 1864 aboard USS Pompero. 2 sailors, black and white, get into a fight. James Conlon is Irish, and he's been arguing with James Dixon, who's African American. And they start swinging punches, and they're each just giving as good as he's getting. They're trading insults, surprisingly, not the ones you'd expect, mostly questioning the legality of the other's birth, shall we say. And finally, the black sailor, Dixon, lucks in a punch on Conlon that sends him to the deck. In falling to the deck, the Irish sailor hits the back of his head on an iron fitting or stanchion and dies instantly. And normally, I know we all know what to expect in this situation in 1864 in America, but the Navy looked at it, talked to witnesses, and decided this was a fair sailor's fight. It wasn't premeditated. It was an accident, and the black sailor is totally exonerated. This would not have happened anywhere else in American society. The money that the Navy took from the value of ships and their cargo didn't just go into pockets somewhere, which surprises me. They invested it. By the end of the war, they had a very solvent $14 million in the bank that they used to pay pensions to sailors and also set up a series of old sailors' homes where no matter what your race was, you had access to them for the rest of your life. The wartime peak reaches by 1964, that 2.5% rapidly grows within a year to about 3.5 times as much, 8.5% African American. By the middle of the war, that again is almost doubled to 15%. The average for 1864 is 23%, but along the Mississippi, you're looking at 34%, a third of the crews are African American. The North Atlantic Squadron has mostly free blacks from the north. The Mississippi Squadron would have contraband from the south. By 65, things are slowing down. Of course, that's been halved to 17. And after discharges, African Americans represent 15% of the fleet, which is still 6 times the pre-war percentage. So how did everyone act in combat? How did the Navy treat African Americans in combat? Radically different than the Army. Even with the USCT regiments online, trained and armed, ready to go, the Army is very reluctant to use them in combat where things might not go well. Grant, for instance, at the Battle of the Crater, decided he would not use the highly trained black regiments, which were equipped with scaling ladders, were prepared for the shock of the explosion, knew how to exploit the surprise. He held them back for fear they would get killed and sent in untrained white troops. These guys, of course, don't know what they're doing. They stop in the crater. It becomes a slaughterhouse. When Grant decides to make defeat worse, he sends in the black soldiers. They can't get through the white soldiers. They're trapped like them, and it is not a good day for the Union. You can't do that on a ship. There are stories of compassionate crews taking the smallest powder monkey, the smallest ship's boy, and hiding him somewhere on board a ship. And that's the one spot a cannonball finds, or it explodes and burns. There's no way, there's no safe place on board a warship. You can't get out of harm's way. Everybody fights. Everybody is in danger. Black sailors fill every single enlisted billet, including 100 deck petty officers. The word deck there is very important. There were a lot of black petty officers, but they're on staff. They are stewards. They work in the mess room. They are servants to the captains and all that. So they have authority on their sleeve, but no command authority. Deck petty officers have command over their gun crews and whatever department they're in. In the course of the war, there's 7 black recipients of Medals of Honor. A lot of these took place in the 1864 Battle of Mobile Bay. Forget which one of these fellows. I think 2 of them actually were working what's called a shell whip, which was how you got ammunition up to the top guns. And at one point, 4 previous stints, if you will, of white sailors have been killed trying to raise shells until a black sailor jumped in and managed to supply the top deck with ammunition. There was an additional danger, of course, for black sailors in combat, which is if they're captured. The South would not countenance the employment of blacks in the Navy or the Army. A lot of black sailors were simply hung or shot outright on the bank if their gunboat was captured. The lucky ones, quote unquote, were sent back into slavery. Knowing that black majority crews were in special danger, the Navy often posted extra Marines on majority black crewed ships when they were going on patrol just to help defend. Wells is very sensitive to this, as he is to getting all his sailors back. In the course of the war, of course, we operated a cartel, a prisoner exchange with the South. Basically, a private would be exchanged for a private, or let's say a lieutenant for 3 privates, like game pieces on a board. Stanton, in charge of the Army, managed the cartel and, of course, always prioritized getting his soldiers back. This bothered Wells no end, and at one point he decided to set up his own cartel, again, not far from DC, and managed to get a fair number of sailors back. Stanton didn't like this at all because every sailor that was returned meant one less soldier, and Lincoln, publicly said, well, the Navy needs its men, but he did tell Wells to stand down. So you can't do that. We need the soldiers. Again, letter of the law, plausible deniability. Wells says, okay, I won't do that anymore. He immediately turns to his officers on station around the rest of the southern coastline and says, you set up your local cartel yourself, and you prioritize getting back my black sailors. And you tell the Rebs, if they keep hanging black sailors, that's what's going to happen to the white sailors we have captured up here. It worked. Wells got his sailors back, and there were very few hangings after that. So what happened after the war? How did we manage to forget all this? White American society suffered memory loss, the Jim Crow laws kick in, and a nasty new word enters the lexicon, Aryanism. It's not an Adolf Hitler specialty. We use that word over here. The South had already used the term master race, but it was the way that their upper crust described, believe it or not, the multi-tongued mongrel northern horde of whites they looked down upon. So that got extended to include Aryanism. There's still a fair number of blacks in the Navy all the way into the 1880s, but what the Navy begins to do is discourage enlistments, and the guys that are there can stay. Jim Crow works against that as well. People forget or overlook what blacks did during the war. This comes out right after the war, this Thomas Nast cartoon when Columbia is asking, what about this guy and not this man? But it just didn't count for some reason. The Navy is becoming more mechanical. Instead of sail handling and carpentry and dead reckoning, now you're dealing with hydraulics, pneumatic stuff and engines that are not sails instead. Jim Crow bars blacks from learning these skills. So the Navy's not saying, no, you can't enter. It's like you can't enter because you don't have the skills. There are some frustrated race riots in the 1890s, which result in black midshipmen who have been allowed into the Naval Academy being hounded out. The percentage of African Americans in the fleet just drops more and more and more. Again, partly the sense among scholars that I've read is this is in part because we conquered the Philippines, and Filipino men are on average shorter and smaller and deemed more docile, quote unquote, than African American sailors. And so the Navy preferred them as servants. I think by the end of World War I, the ratio of Filipinos to blacks in our fleet is 10 to 1. By 1941, they're almost all gone, 0.5%. The needs of World War II change everything, of course. Again, in a pinch, America turned back to its black community. This is well outside the scope of this talk. It's a very rocky road. There's a lot of setbacks and bad episodes. But by the end of the war, there are 2 ships that are predominantly black, the Masons, the destroyer, and the PC-1264 is a subchaser. Its first skipper was Ensign Samuel Gravely, who, 20 years later becomes America's first black admiral, and Wesley Brown is the first to graduate Annapolis in 1949. The Navy mandated integration in 1945, which is 3 years before President Truman ordered it across the military. So they were advanced in that at least. So how has this story been lost? How did we, aside from, collective memory loss, the story of blacks in the Navy and the Union, the Navy, is a subset of Navy history. And that Navy history just gets drowned in the sea of Army ink. This picture is from the GAR chapter or encampment in North Attleboro, Mass, where I live. If you notice the one crazed sailor in the back waving the cutlass to make sure the camera sees him, he represents the exact ratio of sailors to soldiers, 26 soldiers to 1 sailor. Now remember I talked about how the 2 different groups recruited. These guys probably all were in a company of the 7th Massachusetts, which partly went from North Attleboro, Massachusetts. Even if the sailor were born here and went to sea with 10 other locals who were in the Navy, because the way the Navy distributed men across the fleet, if all 10 came back to live here, they don't have a common experience. They can't all write about their experience on board ship XYZ at Battle ABC. These guys can write about everywhere the 7th Mass went. Were we all at Gettysburg? There's 26 different perspectives all on one battle. What's more, they can encourage each other, help each other remember things, write down these beautiful prose histories. The stories we get from sailors are mostly one-offs. Here's what I saw when I was aboard a certain ship, period. There are more subtle ways too that we lose this story. For instance, blacks are very underrepresented in a lot of memorials during the Civil War. Now, I'm not faulting a little town in Vermont or Pennsylvania or New Jersey that has one lone soldier in a statue. If everyone from town went into the army, obviously that's what you're going to put up. But these two monuments are memorials or monuments to branches of the service. In 2019, I did what I consider an extensive search of imagery on the internet. These are the only two integrated ones I could find. One in Ohio, one in Brooklyn, New York. Now, if you look closely, you can argue that the fellow in Cuyahoga is stereotypic. It's a racist representation of a black sailor with exaggerated features. You can say the fellow in Brooklyn is subservient. He's on his knee. But they're there. In Ohio, the fellow is part of a team engaged in combat, and he's doing his share. The fellow on the right is part of a crew. They're poised to do what their officer tells them to do, and he is armed with a standard issue Navy pistol. They are there. It at least makes you wonder, gee, were there blacks in the Navy in the Civil War? This could be a lot more subtle, this trend, and a lot longer in duration. This is a good example of how history can be changed with the stroke of a brush. In 1813, when Oliver Hazard Perry won a surprising victory on the lakes, his capturing 6 British ships, which has never happened before, his flagship, the Lawrence, is cut to pieces. He has 80% casualties. He realizes the ship is sinking. He's about to strike the colors and decides, nope, I'm going to have myself rowed over to the Niagara, which just came into the battle, is fresh and good to go. I got to get there. There are 4 sailors that accompany him. Now remember, Perry's crew is 50% black, so chances of there being a black sailor here are pretty good. And if we look closely, the fellow who's mostly obscured, his skin is really no different in this very early painting of the same year than most of the other guys. But these are all guys that spend time in the sun. They're all bronze. If you look closely at the fellow's hair, it could be African-American hair. So chances are there's a black fellow in there. The artist, who's either Kelly or Baldwin, does take the liberty of putting Alexander, who is Perry's brother or nephew, there's 2 different reports on that, in the boat with him. We know he's not in the boat. He may not even been aboard ship, but it's just too much of a tug on your heartstrings not to have the little kid trying to pull his uncle down or brother down and say, don't get shot, because the British are gunning for him at this point. This is the first representation. Now, by the end of the war, another artist tackles the same image. It's a very heroic one. It's appearing in black and white in a lot of books. Thomas Birch doubles the size of the crew, does get rid of Alexander, so that's accurate at least, but suddenly there are no black sailors anywhere. In 1865, William Powell, an Ohio artist, was asked to paint a scene for a government building out in Ohio. The battle had taken place off the coast of northern Ohio, and he paints the scene as they're leaving the Niagara, the Lawrence, and he's put 3 black sailors in there, 1 aboard ship, 1 in the water asking for help, and 1 fellow who's probably expiring up in the rigging of the ship. So there's a representation there. It's not 50%, but they're there. In 1873, Congress decides they want the same picture put up in a stairwell in the Senate half of the House, and they commission him to paint it again. A few things have changed in this case. There's still a black sailor in the boat. The fellow in the rigging off to the right is still there. The guy in the front of the ship, he's gone. They've added a white sailor, but the white sailor down in the tangled sails is now black. So actually the percentage stays about the same. It's just shifted around for whatever reason. We don't know. In 1911, at the beginning of the worst period of lynchings, which will last about 15 years in American history, E. Percy Moran does a new version of it. Alexander looks a lot more mature, is a lot calmer. That's him in the officer's uniform behind Perry. And the crew is, again, all white, still far too big. We know that there were only 4 sailors, maybe 5, in the boat with Perry, but this just looks more dramatic. We also know for a fact he didn't take Old Glory with him. That would have stayed on the ship. There's a question if he even took his banner, said, don't give up the ship. But it's heroic. In 2013, at the 200th anniversary of the battle, the post office issued a new stamp with Powell's painting in it. For some reason, the Senate decided they had to explain the picture of the stamp because, of course, the painting hangs in a stairwell and the Senate half. And despite at least being Navy history, despite showing one, actually two black sailors that fell in the down sails of the African American, the Senate managed to shoot themselves in the foot by assuring people that the fellow in the boat is probably not a sailor. He's Perry's servant, who they name Hannibal for some reason, and that his presence is actually more an indication of the fact that just a few years before we'd emancipated slaves and probably felt it was good to put a black man in. It really doesn't reflect conditions in 1813. No, it doesn't, because half the crew should be black. This painting in 1943 by Martil Schweig was part of a Works Project Administration series that they sponsored to celebrate little known facets of American history. Her painting may be the very most accurate of the episode and also explain little Alexander's presence in the boat. In this scene, there are 4 adult sailors and a fellow named Old Cyrus, Cyrus Tiffany. Cyrus Tiffany was not Hannibal. He was not a slave. He was a good friend of Perry's from Taunton, Massachusetts, which is just 10 miles to the east of me. He had been a fighter in the Revolution, thereby gaining his freedom. He had lived all those decades in Taunton as a free man. His family was free. And he had served long enough at sea with Perry that he was rated a full-fledged seaman, which means you know everything you need to run this ship, everything. The other fellow in the back of the boat, back up. He may be the kernel of truth behind Alexander. The story exists that someone tried to pull Perry down and protect him from shrapnel and gunshot and cannon with his own body. But it was too much for white artists to admit that Perry's savior might have been African American. And the only reason we won the battle is he arrived safely at the second ship, the Niagara. It was so much more touching to have a little kid in harm's way trying to help uncle and making sure he survives. The 4th crewman may be one of the other 2 blacks who survived the battle, Jesse Williams or Newport Hazard. This sort of whitewashing of history, which I don't just mean in a racial way, it literally is just changing it, removing facts from it, came home to me in 2016 at a talk I was giving in Lynn, Massachusetts. Lynn is a highly diverse school. You name a race, they're in the school, they were in the class. And at one point I flipped to a slide of an African-American sailor and was interrupted by a young African-American in the second row who hadn't been paying all that much attention. They're high school kids. I was happy most of them were. He wasn't. But he perked up when he saw the picture. And he said, wait, there were people there like me? He had never seen a period picture of a black sailor, and had no idea they even served in the Navy or did anything important. I assured him they were. And my point in making a presentation like this is that I don't get asked that question anymore. Thank you all very much. And if you would like, a series of my books are available at chuckveitbooks.com. The notes to accompany this talk, they are not a full-fledged research book, so I don't offer them for sale through Lulu and Amazon just yet. If you go to that URL, just chuckveitbooks.com talks.htm, I guess we'll leave the slide up there for to jot that down. You can get a copy of the notes, which have a lot more detail than I could cram into the presentation. It's a disturbing topic. I hope this has been enlightening. And if you'd like a description of any of the other books, they're also out there on the website. I thank you all very much.
All right, here we go. So from Dick Goldbaum, regards from the home of the 2019 Stanley Cup winners and Jefferson Barracks, Rosemary, we're in upstate New York. I'm originally from the Finger Lakes area. She is in Watervliet, outside of Albany, and is a good friend. So there we are. Terry Wilson says, we are proud that Gideon Wells came from Glastonbury, Connecticut. Very good. Mike Hoover. Mike says, were black sailors paid the same as whites, where powder monkeys mostly, or were powder monkeys mostly blacks?
Okay, everyone, depending on their rating, is paid the exact same amount. same bonuses, same bounties for captured ships, exact same rate of pay. And no, powder monkeys were not universally African-American boys. There was mostly a size requirement because you've got a ship congested with adults fighting a battle, and all the powder, of course, is kept down in powder magazines, away from sparks and shrapnel and things like that. So basically, young boys, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, are tasked with running the stuff back and forth. It's a very dangerous job. Their small size allows them to pass more safely in the narrow hallways of the ship between decks and all that than could adults. And so, no, they don't really look at skin color for a powder monkey, not at all.
And Rosemary asks, was there a difference in average age for the Army and the Navy during the Civil War?
It's a little bit higher for the Navy simply because, and you can see this in some period photos, once you have literally learned the ropes, you may not be able to haul on them much anymore, but you are a wealth of knowledge for training new sailors. When sailors were recruited, most of them came from a nautical background, merchant fleets, whaling fleets, things like that, maybe prior Navy service. But when you're on that receiving ship, there's no set regimen of instruction. You don't drill this week, you don't learn how to tie knots the next week. The Navy is a big believer in on-the-job training. Remember, they're behind in the recruiting game because so many people flock to the armies. So I've heard stories of people being swept up at rendezvous, and the following week they're on a ship out to sea. And so you're learning the ropes literally on the job as you go. So you have a lot of older fellows in the Navy who are valued for their skills and kept there.
Rosemary also asks, were the Marines ranked like the sailors or soldiers?
More like soldiers. They serve as ship's police. They're the only ones, again, that have personal weapons on board the ship because they're there to defend the officers in case of a mutiny. The sailors had an adversarial stance towards them, considered they were mad dogs you kept on a leash until you need them, and then you're glad they're on your side, quote unquote. If you'll notice, there's a famous picture at the Battle of Mobile Bay where Farragut is up, standing on the poop deck, leaning out the rigging, looking at the Tennessee as they're pummeling it. And in the foreground is an African-American sailor. But then look at the background below Farragut's feet. You'll notice the gun crew has Marine Corps kepis. And what that means is that the Marines there's nothing to snipe at against an ironclad. So Farragut, or Captain Percival, has given them their own gun and basically challenged them and the sailors to see who can fire the fastest and most accurate. So they're heightening the competition that already exists between the sailors and the Marines. But they exist on the ship, but in a world slightly outside that of the normal sailors.
All right. So Christina asks, will you be writing a book on this subject? It seems like a great topic to share right now.
It is. And seeing as how I've already done this little notes to it, the core of the research is there. It's stuff I've studied for years. I first gave this talk, I think, about 2011, maybe 2012 at the latest. And again, because it wasn't my original research, which I prefer, I like finding new things, but I realized this is new information for so many people, and it is timely. Yeah, this one is in the works. I would think probably sometime next year, 2021, I'd look for a book.
All right. So are there other questions? There's a lot of praise here, Chuck.
Right, I appreciate that. I just noticed someone had said we've lost a part of our history. It's not lost unless we don't go looking for it. That's one thing I've learned in writing my 6 research books and looking up stuff for this talk and this little booklet, is that it's all out there, but it just depends on what we focus on. You just have to dig a lot sometimes, but it's out there.
Roger says, as a Navy veteran, I had no idea about the history of the African-American sailors.
No, again, like I said with that one slide of it's a wonderful slide, the GAR picture. There are so few sailors writing stories. I actually have to sometimes tell people, no, they could write. They understood English, how to speak and how to write. They weren't illiterate, for goodness sakes, because so few stories come from the Navy side of the war. It's just totally overlooked. And as a post-war publisher, I understand that. Here comes the sailor with his story. It's going to resonate with, you know, the other 137,000 sailors north and south. Here comes a soldier with his story. It's going to resonate with several million potential readers. Who am I going to publish first? You're obviously going to go with the soldier. And there's an awful lot of them writing like crazy, whereas the sailors don't. So.
Yeah, that veteran sailor with the saber. Wow, what a crazy guy.
He outlived all of them too, by the way.
Excellent.
He lasted until 1937, I think, when they were all in the ground.
Yeah, Christina says, we have many general memoirs. Are there memoirs of admirals you could recommend?
Not a lot of them wrote memoirs per se, and a number of them unfortunately passed soon after the war. It took a toll on them. I mean, Farragut, for instance, was allowed to retire before the end of the war just by pleading exhaustion. He's already pretty long in the tooth, and life at sea is rough. It takes a lot of sailors just from, you know, exposure, the rigors of combat, and just sailing a wooden ship or a steamship at that time. I can't really think of too many that wrote autobiographies. Mostly it's after the fact that other people write about them.
My. Other questions, folks?
Oh, we have a footnote to that. I forgot. If you go to the website of the Navy and Marine Living History Association, it's navyandmarine.org. We do have a list out there of a bibliography of books for all time periods of American naval history that you could look through and, you know, select books from there.
So Dr. Willen asks, did any other African Americans serve as pilots besides Robert Smalls?
Yes, by the end of the war, and again, this is a technical matter, but it did happen. There were 7 black sailors rated as pilots, and a pilot has control of the ship when it's in waters that he's been tasked to navigate. So in effect, at least on an interim basis, he outranks the white officers on the ship. So yeah, there were 7 others.
Yeah, Robert Smalls' story is pretty unique. Rosemary also asked, did many of the sailors go into the whalers rank or the merchant fleet?
I mean, after the war? I assume that's what she means. Yeah. Whaling is actually passing at this point in time. During the war, and again, if you've got pencil and paper handy, a resource that I offer for free, if you go to USNLP, now back up, look through my list of books for the series called Upon the Best Authority. Those are 4 ponderous tomes of period newspapers I transcribed. Don't buy the books. There's so much paper, they're ridiculously priced at rock bottom. The information's all out there for free. If you follow the link, you can read newspapers from the beginning of the war to the end, and I promise you it is by turns hilarious, terrifying, scary. It's American society that we haven't really delved very deep into. One thing I realized was that rock oil, as they called it, was the up-and-coming thing. Whaling was already beginning to pass by the time of the Civil War. And sometimes they didn't want to see it pass. I know in New Bedford or Fall River, I forget which, the 2 big whaling cities in Massachusetts, there was one point in time where even though they grilled a lot of whalermen, no one was able to explain how rock oil tanks managed to explode and burn. They were vandalized, basically. So there's a lot of industrial sabotage going on there. But the rock oil men were going to win out. It was faster to get it out of the ground than it was to chase it halfway around the planet and kill whales for it. So no, very few people went back into whaling after the war. Certainly whalers that had the experience hung on to the very end, but it's a dying industry.
Ed wants to know, are there other areas of this subject matter you want to look into in the future?
Actually, in doing this research, I had to pull myself back from putting in another dozen slides just on World War II. That, like I mentioned when I spoke about that, it was a very rocky road. There were a fair number of advances. In the end, there was ultimate good come out of it. But, and again, I'm quoting somebody else here, it was the Navy had evolved into a club for white men, and they liked it that way, and they wanted to keep it that way. There was a lot of resistance to integration in the fleet. And what was sad was all the complaints came back again. Oh, we can't integrate a ship. The efficiency will go down. You know, there'll be fights and all that. And there was some of that in the Civil War, but captains quickly realized, yeah, the whole crew has to work together to make the ship run. So no matter what the orders out of Washington were, savvy skippers realized, you guys will learn to work together. Otherwise, you know, the ship will not function properly in combat or just underway. But we worked through them all again, just relearned everything as we had many times in the past, and integrated the Navy. But the World War II stuff is very, very fascinating. I probably blew 3 days researching that and deciding it was beyond the scope of this talk.
Right. So, other questions, folks? Well, I don't see any others coming up.
Okay.
Everyone, I'd like to thank you for being here tonight and participating. And Chuck, as always, another great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you.